Alright, me and Goosey are here making a tissue holder today. The other dogs are barking in the background, so if you hear those, don't mind them. They're fine. It's a rainy, cold day, so they're laying in their beds downstairs. We're going to make a travel tissue holder today, and I got these 2 fat quarters from Walmart. And they had some really cute fabrics there. This one is a Disney Cats fabric because, you know, I'm a Disney adult. And I picked this to go with the lining because it matched these little knitting balls of yarn right here. And so we're going to make our tissue travel tissue holder out of these 2 fabrics. I think they were like $1.57 for each piece, and we're only going to use a teeny tiny little bit of it. So for our main fabric that's going to be on the outside, we're going to cut a piece that is 5.5 by 6.5 inches. So I'm going to use my rotary cutter and a ruler for this, but you could measure it out and draw it out with a pen or a marking tool on the back. So we need to make it 5.5 by 6.5. So I'm trying to decide which direction I want this to face. So I'm going to go 5.5 width on this because this is a directional fabric. All these cats have to be facing the same way, kind of. All right, so we're going to go 5.5 inches over. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.5 inches over. And we're going to line up our ruler on here. And then we're going to go 6.5 inches tall. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we're going to go to about there. And if you really wanted to fussy cut this, you can figure out your cut to where you have exactly which part of the fabric you want on there. Okay, so let's make sure that this is 6.5 inches tall, 6.5. So then I'm going to turn this to where I can cut it straighter. If you do not have one of these cutting mats and rulers, you should save up and invest in one. They have some at Walmart. They're not terribly expensive, but they make cutting straight lines and squares way easier on they're made for quilting, but you can cut really anything with it. I have 2 mats put together on my table, so my whole table is a cutting mat. All right, so that's our main piece of fabric, and then our lining fabric is going to be 5.5 by 7.5. So let's line this back up. Got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.5. And this time we're going to cut it 7.5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.5 is about right there. Now this is just for a little tissue holder, so it does not have to be super perfect. I just cut that crooked, but that's okay. I'm going to go ahead and cut this other piece off here. All right, so we have our 2 pieces of fabric. Now you could take some quilt batting if you wanted to, and you could quilt all of this. I'm not going to line it. I'm just going to do it with 2 fat quarters today, so it can make it a super simple project, and it's super affordable. You can make this out of scraps that you have laying around or anything like that. So I'm going to take these 2 pieces over to my sewing machine. Okay, now that we're at the sewing machine, we're going to take our 2 pieces, and yes, the lining is longer than the outside fabric, and I'll show you why in just a second. So we're going to take our 2 pieces and put them right sides together, so pretty sides touching, and we're going to line it up along the 5.5 inch long edge. You can clip this or pin this if you want to, but we're sewing such a short amount that I'm just going to go with it without pinning it. The edge of your normal size presser foot is 1/4 inch, or this line right here. On my machine, I use an 1/8 inch foot for bag making. So if you have a 1/4 inch foot, just line it up with the edge of your foot. And we're going to back stitch at the beginning and the end, and we're just going to sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way across this 5.5 inch side. Now, you could take your machine and zigzag all of these seams to keep them from fraying. They're going to be inside a tissue holder, so for this project, it's not super necessary. My machine is a straight stitch only machine, so I'm not going to do that. Then we're going to turn our fabric the other way around, and we're going to match up the other 5.5 inch edges. And you'll notice that your lining fabric is bigger than your outside fabric. It's supposed to be. So we're going to line those two edges up, and we're going to stitch that with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, now that we have both of our seams sewn, we're going to take this over to our ironing board and we're going to turn it right side out. So I'll meet you at the ironing board. Okay, now that we have this turned right side out, you're going to take your seam allowance, which is a 1/4 inch, and you're going to press it towards the lining side. And you're going to basically wrap your lining around the seam allowance so that it's peeking out on the front side of your tissue holder. So what I did was I folded the seam allowance to the lining and wrapped it around and then pressed it flat. And when you do the other side, you'll have a 1/4 inch of your lining fabric showing on both sides of your tissue holder, if you cut it all correctly and sewed it with perfect seam allowances. So then we're going to give it a press, make it all nice and flat. If it's off just a little bit, that's okay. Just kind of wiggle it around and give it a good press, and it should press out flat. Then we're going to take this back over to our sewing machine. Okay, now on the front side, I'm going to fold this in half and I'm going to find the center of the front and back. And I usually just do this by like running my fingernail over it and making a little crease, or you can mark it with a marking pen, or you could even take it and just snip off a teeny tiny little triangle, and that will mark where your center is. So let me do that to both sides. You can trim up any excess hangover or any threads that are hanging off to make it all nice and clean. So you just clip off those little tiny triangles, and that marks the center of your tissue holder. So we're going to take this with the lining side up, and I keep unthreading my sewing machine. Okay, once you've marked the centers, you're going to lay it with the right side up. You're going to fold each edge in to where the edge that you pressed flat matches the center marks. And I like using these little sewing clips instead of pins because they're quick and they're easy and they don't make a hole in your fabric. So if you're using something like vinyl or leather, then they won't make any marks on your fabric. And you're going to take this over to your sewing machine, and we're going to sew the side seams with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, back stitching at the beginning and the end. Okay, you're going to make sure that the edges are just barely touching, and you're going to sew it at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, back stitching at the beginning and end. And then flip it around and do the other side. So it should look like that when you're finished. And now I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to trim off some of the seam allowance. You could zigzag that or run it through a serger if you have a serger to make it a nice clean finished edge, but this is just a tissue holder, so it's okay. Nobody's going to see those raw edges in there. Okay, and then now we're going to take this and we are going to flip it right sides out. And you can use something like a chopstick, or I have these point turners that my husband 3D printed me. And you're going to poke out your corners, being careful not to poke through the fabric. That way you have a nice sharp corner on each side. And now it's time to put your tissues in. So I have this little package of travel tissues, and I'm just going to open it up and tear off the tab or cut it off. And we're just going to put our tissues in. You could take the tissues out of the plastic if you wanted to put them in there, but I feel like they stay together better if you leave them in the plastic. And then you can just pull one out of the top. It makes a really cute little tissue holder for your purse.